What we see happening in this scene is...
What happened?
You have to forcibly disconnect. You have lived in this delusion for so long that your mind believes that it's real. You have to eliminate the anchor.
This moment changes everything that we ever thought we knew about this town and the entity who is in control of the monsters. As what you're looking at right here is undeniably one of the most important scenes in this entire show, because what this scene really tells us is that the only reason that Victor's dad was brought into the town is so that he could be used to eliminate the anchor. In other words, Victor's dad was summoned into Fromville so that he could kill Victor, his own son. This has absolutely massive implications on the story. Like, first of all, I want you to ask yourself a very simple question, and that is, now that we know what Victor's dad's purpose actually is, what does that tell you about the boy in white, who is the one who sent Tabitha to Camden, Maine, so that she could bring Victor's dad back to the town? And when you consider that the man in yellow had to infect Victor's dad with his blood in order for this place to start sending him these visions that made him come to the conclusion that he has to eliminate the anchor, who is more than likely Victor, his own son, the signs that the boy in white is clearly working with the man in yellow, assuming that they're not the same exact being, have never been stronger at any point in the entire show than now. Like, immediately after the writers established that Ethan is going to be the replacement for Victor, we literally see the man in yellow waving at Ethan, just like we previously saw the boy in white himself waving at Ethan. And of course, there's the scene at the massacre where the boy in white is waving at Victor. There are so many different things pointing to them somehow being directly connected to each other. Like, just watch this scene and see for yourself.
Mom, it's Thomas.
What do you want?
Come to the RV or I'll hurt Julie and Ethan.
Mom's in an ambulance. You have to help her.
Who is this?
It's Thomas.
Who are you talking to?
Should be watching Julie and Ethan,
You leave my children alone.
but they're not your children anymore.
In this scene with the boy on the telephone calling Ethan, we see this voice on the telephone that is obviously a boy, much like the boy in white, informing Ethan that his mother would be coming back into the town with an ambulance. And then we see that the Nightwalkers had already set up a trap before the ambulance had arrived. This immediately tells us that the same being who controls the monsters is the same being who brings people into the town. So when you consider that the boy in white obviously knew that Tabitha would be coming back into the town when he pushed her off of the lighthouse, and how we see that she just happens to bring the same person whose entire role is to take out the anchor into the town with her, something that is clearly beneficial to the man in yellow, the dots are starting to connect in more ways than one. Even in this episode, it is specifically mentioned by Victor that the morning after the massacre, the boy in white led Victor to the peach truck and it was filled to the brim with peaches. This is massive in so many different ways that it's crazy, because it tells us two different things. The first is that the boy in white knew that the massacre would be happening before it did, and he never intended to stop it. We know this to be true because Victor specifically says that the same day he comes out of the root cellar, which was after the night of the massacre, that the boy in white led him to the peach truck, meaning it was already there. Basically, this tells us that the boy in white has the ability to decide who comes into the town, which is how he was able to pull the truck that was full of peaches into Fromland in the first place before the massacre. And it means that the massacre going the way that it did was always a part of the boy in white's plan, because he always knew and therefore intended that Victor would survive it in order for him to have brought the peaches for Victor in the first place. But what you really need to focus on here is that the Nightwalkers have allowed Victor to live in this town for 40 years, and Victor literally said that he saw the man in yellow eating his mother, and the man in yellow proceeded to let him go and then allowed him to live in Fromland for the next 40 years after that. In other words, what this tells us is that the only reason Victor's dad is being told to eliminate Victor right now is because Victor has outlived his usefulness. And since they now have Ethan as a replacement, it's time for Victor to get taken out so that Ethan can be officially slot in as Victor's replacement. Basically, Victor's dad was only brought into the town so that this place could torture Victor one last time and squeeze as much fear and suffering out of him as much as possible right before they take him out. But this is just barely scratching the surface on how badly we are being deceived and manipulated by this place. Like, this scene right here is a moment that you really have to focus on, because what you're looking at here is that Jade, Boyd, and Kenny have to be some of the dumbest people I've ever seen in my life. I fail to understand how none of these people can see that nobody is going to get anyone else home until you understand that you're being spied on by the monsters, how you're being spied on by the monsters, and how to disable or entirely remove, however it is, or whatever their source of information about the people of the town is. Like, after what happened with Kenny trying to use the voodoo totem on the milkman, how can they not see that it is not possible to defeat the monsters or even escape this place without first identifying what the method of surveillance is? What are the limitations of that same surveillance system, and therefore how can we exploit the limitations of that system to our advantage? Because the fact that Jade, Boyd, and Kenny are actually considering this absolutely horrible plan, which will obviously get people killed down in those tunnels, without addressing the obvious elephant in the room, i.e. that the Nightwalkers clearly knew in advance about their plan to try to kill one of them with a voodoo totem, or that they also somehow knew that Boyd said this place could not break him even though there were no monsters nearby and it was daytime, shows that all of the people in this town are complete idiots. Like, the first question on all of their minds should be, how did the monsters know they were going to use the voodoo totem? And on that specific night, because until they understand how the enemy is getting this insane level of intelligence on the people of the town, obviously none of the plans they make are ever going to work. And do you know why that is? It's because by the time they enact their plan, the monsters will have already developed a counter strategy against them, thanks to the surveillance system. This is why the monsters are always 2 steps ahead of these people, because literally everyone here is an idiot. And them pretending that Boyd's 3 decades in the military is somehow relevant in this episode is laughable, when Boyd can't even put 2 and 2 together and realize that if they knew about the plan with the totem and what he said in the forest, despite the fact that there was no monsters around, then the Nightwalkers will also obviously know about their laughable plan to uproot the Burrow Tree, which doesn't even consider what they would do if they find monsters sleeping in the same part of the underground tunnels where the children's bones are supposedly located in. And this is before we even address that Jade is just assuming that the Burrow Tree is the same place that he saw the symbol of the roots. But there's actually 2 different Burrow Trees in Fromville. And the boy in white didn't even mention the Burrow Tree. He just said that the children poured their hopes into the tree. They're just assuming that it's this Burrow Tree and not the other one, or that it's even a Burrow Tree. Like, the tomb wasn't even there when Jade has the vision of the children laying on the 7 slabs. And when Jade had the vision that actually had the tomb with the bones, the roots of the tree were not present. So basically what I'm trying to say is that this plan, cooked up by Boyd, Jade, and Kenny, is just a mess in every way. There's so many different problems with it that it's crazy. It doesn't make sense in any way. And something else we have to talk about here is that in this same exact episode, we see the man in yellow going into the Matthews house and we see him asking, hello? So he didn't know that the house was empty before he went in, right? That is the only logical explanation. Because if there was no one there, then who exactly was he pretending for? The house was completely empty. And we also saw him earlier going into the sheriff's station in this same episode, and he literally asks, Sheriff Boyd, are you here? So naturally, the conclusion that you come to based off of these 2 scenes is that the man in yellow is not all-seeing and he is not all-present, correct? But these 2 scenes are then contradicted later on in this same episode when we see that the man in yellow somehow knew immediately after Tabitha had stepped into the same house, which he was clearly unable to observe earlier on in this same episode, because we see the voice is calling itself the name of Tabitha's youngest child, Thomas, clearly somehow knew that she was there in order to call her on the telephone, which I assume is a telepathic vision. So what's going on here? Like, it doesn't make sense. The logistics of what we're seeing here are just impossible. And you cannot use the excuse that the man in yellow's abilities are somehow different based on which form he is using. Because we literally saw the man in yellow was aware of whether or not Sarah was drinking the water from the glass in the diner the way he wanted her to, because he threw himself off the pool when Sarah didn't do what he had ordered to do as the voices in her head. And all of this is even after you ignore the fact that the man in yellow had to go all the way to the RV from the house of the Matthews, remove his disguise for Sophia, shapeshift into the man in yellow, put on his disguise for the man in yellow, and he's supposed to do all of this in reverse before going back into the town so that he can become Sophia once again after he confronts Tabitha at the RV. And we haven't even accounted for him placing those drawings up on the RV. So the entire thing just doesn't make any sense. How could he do all of this? There's so many contradictions here, because unless there's multiple versions of the man in yellow's story walking from the future to the past, or that the being who appeared to Tabitha in that that scene simply was not the man in yellow, and it was something completely different pretending to be the man in yellow. What we are seeing here literally just doesn't make sense. And I don't know if it's just bad writing or if it's actually supposed to mean something. This is especially curious after the last episode, which depicted the car that was supposed to be Victor's mom's being extremely different to the car that we see in Tabitha's vision that Victor's mom was actually driving. So does that mean anything? Or is all of this just extremely sloppy writing combined with intentionally deceptive cinematography? Like, they wanted us to notice that, they emphasized it in the shot, and therefore they wanted us to theorize about it. And it's the same thing with the man in yellow's constantly fluctuating skill set. How was he able to know whether or not Sarah had drunk the water from the jug in the diner, but he wasn't able to know that Boyd wasn't in the sheriff's station, or that there wasn't anybody at the Matthews' house? Does this mean anything, or are they intentionally writing these scenes in such a way as to mislead the audience, just to say, he was pretending that he didn't know, for us, the real people watching the show? Ridiculous. Either way, there's so many different hints in this episode that Victor clearly wasn't the first boy to be an anchor for the town, and that's something I talked about extensively before. So go watch this video right here to see why Victor obviously was not the first boy to survive the massacre, and why Ethan is also clearly supposed to play the same exact role after the town kills off Victor.